The spectacle of violence, the tragic legacy of lynching in America. Picture this, a crowd of thousands gathering in a small southern town, not for a fair or festival, but to witness a brutal act of racial violence. Families arrive with picnic baskets, children in tow, ready to watch as another human being is lynched, beaten, tortured, and hanged before their eyes. What should be met with horror is instead treated as a celebration. Photographs are taken, body parts are collected as souvenirs, and postcards of the event are sold as keepsakes. This was the grim reality of lynching in America, a haunting chapter of racial violence that permeated the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But lynching wasn't just an act of violence, it was a spectacle, commercialized, normalized, and terrifyingly public. The dark history of lynching in the United States stretches across more than a century. It is a story not only of racial hatred and violence, but also of a culture that, in many instances, celebrated such acts. Particularly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, lynching was not an act done in secret or shame, but often a public event that drew large crowds of onlookers, including families with young children. These events, held in public squares, parks, and sometimes in front of courthouses, were gruesome exhibitions of violence where the boundaries of morality were suspended and brutality reigned. The story of lynching is one that intertwines America's racial history, its obsession with mob justice, and the disturbing capacity of human beings to turn violence into a spectacle. Lynching is often remembered as a practice used to enforce racial subjugation, particularly against African Americans. However, it is crucial to recognize that lynching was not solely a Southern phenomenon, nor was it exclusively targeted at black individuals. In the American West, lynching was used as a form of frontier justice, particularly against horse thieves, cattle rustlers, and those accused of crimes like murder or robbery. White people, particularly those accused of these crimes, were also lynched. Between 1882 and 1968, an estimated 4,743 lynchings were recorded in the United States. Of these, roughly 3,446 victims were black, while nearly 1,297 were white. Yet, while lynching as a tool of vigilante justice affected all races, it is the racial lynchings of African Americans that most seared into the national consciousness. These lynchings were often carried out with extraordinary brutality, involving torture, mutilation, and public humiliation. African American men were overwhelmingly the targets, often accused of crimes like rape or murder, charges frequently fabricated or exaggerated to incite mob violence. Lynchings became a way to reinforce white supremacy and maintain social control in the post-Reconstruction South, where fears of black economic and political advancement were pervasive. The public nature of these events added another layer of horror. Lynchings were advertised in advance through newspapers and word of mouth. Townspeople would gather in large numbers, sometimes numbering in the thousands, to witness the violence firsthand. In many cases, these crowds treated the event like a celebration. Families would bring food, and vendors would sell concessions, turning the event into a grotesque carnival of cruelty. The atmosphere was one of festivity, not of somber justice. This normalization of violence revealed the deep-rooted racism that pervaded American society at the time. One of the most disturbing aspects of lynching culture, particularly when African Americans were the victims, was the way these brutal acts of violence were turned into public spectacles and even commercialized. Lynchings of black men, women, and children were not only acts of racial terror, but also social events, grotesquely treated as occasions for celebration. White communities gathered, sometimes in the thousands, to witness these heinous acts. Entire families attended, men, women, and children, and often came prepared as if for a picnic, packing lunches and snacks, treating the lynching as a form of grotesque entertainment. After a lynching, white onlookers often took souvenirs from the victims' bodies, pieces of clothing, hair, teeth, fingers, or even bones. This practice was both chilling and dehumanizing, reducing black victims to objects of morbid curiosity and trophies of racial violence. Keeping body parts as keepsakes turned lynchings into ritualized expressions of racial dominance, reinforcing the belief that African American lives were disposable and of lesser value. These physical remnants were kept as souvenirs to commemorate the mob's participation in what was, to them, an event that asserted white supremacy. Perhaps even more disturbing was the widespread practice of photographing lynchings. The bodies of black men and women, often mutilated and burned, would hang from trees or poles, surrounded by white crowds who posed and smiled for the camera. These images were then printed on postcards, which were sold and circulated, both as memorabilia and as a way to spread the terror of racial violence. Postcards often depicted lynched African Americans with captions like, "Wish you were here," trivializing the death of the victim and turning it into a casual, boastful message. This chilling practice further dehumanized black victims, turning their suffering and deaths into commodities for white consumption. Lynching as a social event, complete with food, children, photographs, and souvenirs, reflected the normalization of extreme racial violence. The fact that these gatherings were treated as family-friendly events speaks to the deep-rooted racism of the time, where the torture and murder of African Americans was not only tolerated but celebrated by certain segments of white society. What should have been viewed as a horrifying spectacle was instead turned into a communal celebration of racial domination. The commercialization of lynching through photographs, postcards, and souvenirs underscored the way racial violence was not just an act of punishment or revenge, but a deliberate, ritualized spectacle that reinforced white supremacy. It wasn't enough to take the life of a black person. The mob had to memorialize the event, sharing it with others and commemorating it with tokens of their dominance. These images and mementos sent a chilling message to black communities. They were always vulnerable, and the white mob held unchecked power over their lives. Though lynching is most often associated with the racial violence against African Americans in the South, it was not a uniquely Southern phenomenon. In the American West, lynching was a tool of frontier justice, where lawlessness often prevailed. Here, the victims were often white men accused of crimes like horse theft, cattle rustling, and murder. In the absence of formal legal systems, mobs frequently took the law into their own hands, delivering swift and brutal justice to those they deemed guilty. In the late 1800s, lynchings were a common occurrence in places like Montana, Texas, and California, where vigilante justice was often the only available form of law enforcement. For example, in 1874, vigilantes in Montana hanged 5 men accused of being horse thieves. In many of these cases, there was little to no legal process, and those accused were executed without trial. This type of lynching was framed as a way to maintain order in a chaotic and often violent frontier society. Between 1882 and 1968, an estimated 1,297 white people were lynched in the United States, many of them in the western frontier. While this number is significant, it pales in comparison to the nearly 3,446 African Americans who were lynched during the same period. The lynchings of white individuals were often motivated by accusations of criminal activity, whereas lynchings of black individuals were overwhelmingly motivated by a desire to enforce racial subjugation and maintain white supremacy. The key distinction between Western lynchings and those in the South was the racial dimension. In the West, lynching was often used as a crude form of frontier justice, focused on punishing crimes, whereas in the South, lynching became an instrument of terror, used to reinforce the social, political, and economic subjugation of African Americans. The racialized nature of Southern lynchings revealed the broader societal goal of maintaining racial hierarchy and ensuring the oppression of black people. In the southern United States, lynching was inextricably linked to the enforcement of white supremacy. Following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, white Southerners worked to re-establish racial control over African Americans, particularly through the institution of Jim Crow laws, which codified segregation and disenfranchised black citizens. In this context, lynching became a tool not just for punishing individual transgressions, but for terrorizing the entire African American population. African Americans were targeted for a variety of alleged offenses, from petty theft to accusations of sexual violence against white women. But the accusations were often fabrications or exaggerated. Black men in particular were the primary targets of lynchings, as the myth of the hypersexual and violent black male was used to justify acts of extreme brutality. In reality, Many black men were lynched for minor infractions or for simply challenging the racial order, attempting to vote, defending their property, or even succeeding economically in ways that threatened white supremacy. Lynchings were public acts meant to send a clear and chilling message to the entire black community. Any attempt to assert equality or challenge the racial status quo would be met with death. Often the accusations that led to a lynching were merely pretexts for carrying out racial violence. The true motivation was to maintain the social hierarchy and ensure that African Americans remained powerless and subjugated. The lynching of Emmett Till in 1955 is perhaps one of the most infamous examples of this racial terror. Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago, was accused of whistling at a white woman in Mississippi. For this alleged crime, he was abducted, tortured, and murdered. His body was so mutilated that it was almost unrecognizable. Till's killers were acquitted by an all-white jury, despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt. This case, along with many others, illustrated how deeply ingrained racism was in Southern society, and how lynching was used as a tool to enforce that racism. Despite the widespread acceptance of lynching in certain parts of the country, there were many individuals and organizations who fought to bring an end to this horrific practice. African American activists, in particular, played a key role in raising awareness about the brutal reality of lynching and advocating for legal reforms to stop it. Ida B. Wells Barnett, a pioneering journalist and civil rights activist, was one of the most prominent voices against lynching. Wells began her anti-lynching campaign in the 1890s after 3 of her friends were lynched in Memphis. Her investigative work exposed the false accusations used to justify lynchings and highlighted the racial motivations behind these acts. In her pamphlet, Wells revealed the horrific truth about lynching, challenging the narrative that these acts were carried out in the name of justice. Through her tireless work, Wells and others helped to bring national and international attention to the issue of lynching. Organizations like the NAACP also played a key role in advocating for federal anti-lynching legislation. Despite numerous attempts to pass anti-lynching bills in Congress, these efforts were repeatedly blocked by Southern lawmakers who were committed to maintaining the racial order. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s ultimately brought an end to the widespread practice of lynching, but the scars of this violent history remain. The legacy of lynching continues to haunt America, as the terror and trauma inflicted upon African American communities have had lasting effects. Lynching is one of the darkest chapters in American history, a practice rooted in violence, hatred, and the systematic dehumanization of African Americans. The public nature of lynchings, the crowds, the photographs, the souvenirs, reveals not just the brutality of the act itself, but the widespread societal acceptance of racial violence. From the American West, where lynching served as a tool of vigilante justice, to the American South, where it became a mechanism of racial terror, lynching left a profound and tragic mark on the nation. Though lynching has long since ceased as a widespread practice, its legacy lives on in the racial divisions and injustices that still plague the United States today. The victims of lynching deserve to be remembered not just as individuals who suffered unspeakable violence, but as symbols of the fight for justice and equality. The haunting images of postcards, the stories of mutilation and souvenirs, and the memories of those who lived through this era of terror remind us of the work that still needs to be done to fully reckon with America's painful past. Only through acknowledging and understanding this history can we hope to move forward toward a more just and equal society.